טוב לכולם, אורחים ואורחות נכבדים, סטודנטים וסטודנטיות יקרים, חברי וחברות סגל, תודה שבאתם. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, guests, students, members of faculty. My name is Deborah Golden and I'm from the Faculty of Education here at the university. Thank you for coming. A very warm welcome to you all. The occasion of our gathering together this evening is to commemorate the second anniversary of the death of our dear and sorely missed colleague, Professor Ilan Gur-Ze'ev. In his memory, we at the Faculty of Education, University of Haifa, established a lecture series in his name, which we hope and believe will continue the essential spirit of Ilan's work. This spirit, I think, consisted of three interwoven aspects. First, the unswerving insistence on addressing the most fundamental questions that lie at the heart of the educational enterprise. Second, scholarship, solid learning that is both in-depth and wide-reaching. Third, belief in the role of the public intellectual, the idea that the power of the mind and its public articulation actually do matter, do make a difference. It is in this spirit that we are honored tonight by the very distinguished presence of our guest Professor Júlia Kristeva, who this year is recipient of an honorary degree of Doctor of Philosophy at the University of Haifa, and from whom we will shortly be hearing a lecture. But first, I'm delighted to present our colleague and Dean of the Faculty of Education at the University, Professor Lily Orland-Barak.
It is with great pleasure and honor that we host Professor Júlia Kristeva on her lecture, New Forms of Revolt, at the Faculty of Education, the University of Haifa. Professor Kristeva is indeed a Renaissance woman. Her work covers vast fields of knowledge, amongst which psychoanalysis, philosophy, theology, literature, and political science, fields in which she navigates inventively, introducing notions which have proved to be crucial for thinking our human experience. Júlia Kristeva is known to Israeli readers. Her books, Tales of Love, Sipurei Ahava, that's in Hebrew, Powers of Horror, Kochot HaEima, In the Beginning Was Love, Bereshit Hayta Ahava, Black Sun, Shemesh Chora, and Strangers Than Ourselves, Zarim Le'atzmenu, were all translated into Hebrew. Each book foregrounds a notion which is profoundly elaborated, both from the conceptual and historical point of view, notions such as love, abjection, melancholia, the stranger, the maternal, and the loving father. Júlia Kristeva has always been contemplating the relations between our mental existence and the contemporary political situation. From her early essay, Psychoanalysis and the Polis, until her later two volumes, Micropolitik, as well as through her concrete interventions in state affairs which touch upon the condition of women and handicapped people, she has been engaged in discussing the new maladies of the soul, as she formulated it in an ever-changing, dynamic, socio-political context. Her work, therefore, bears critical implications to the work we carry in our educational field, where the intimate and the political meet, constantly defying us with new and entangled challenges. It is in this context that we ask Professor Kristeva to speak to us today about the notion of revolt, both the intimate as well as the social and political revolt, on which she has been working since the 90s and which, of course, connects to her own personal experience as a student who came to live in Paris not long before the revolution of May '68. How should we conceive the idea of revolt in retrospect? What new forms would it take in our days of socio-political stagnation? The Faculty of Education sets itself the goal of representing the complex of individual voices featuring the Israeli society, turning it into a thinking community which embraces the foreign without backgrounding or obscuring it. In this context, I would like to conclude with the last lines from Julia Kristeva's beautiful book entitled Strangers to Ourselves. A paradoxical community is emerging, made up of foreigners who are reconciled with themselves to the extent that they recognize themselves as foreigners. The multinational society would thus be the consequence of an extreme individualism, but conscious of its discontents and limits, knowing only indomitable people, ready to help themselves in their weakness, a weakness whose other name is a radical strangeness. Dear Professor Kristeva, the stage is all yours. I am so happy to entrust it in your reassuring hands.
Thank you, ladies. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for welcoming here in this wonderful University of Haifa that I had the pleasure to visit for the first time some days ago. Thank you for your presence. I would like, first of all, to thank the University of Haifa for the honor they bestowed on me with the title of Doctor Honoris Causa that has been already mentioned. I know the efforts and the talents that your academic community employs to illuminate, interpret, and develop relationships with the diverse communities that contribute to Israeli democracy and to respond to the conflicts, dangers, and threats that weigh on the fragile peace in this part of the world. I hope that my reflection will resonate with your preoccupations, and especially with regard to the aspiration of the young, which, as I understand it, is at the heart of the university's mission. As you already noticed, my English is far from being perfect, so I'll read my paper, and I'll be glad to have the discussion in a more relaxed and convivial way. So, the topic of this presentation is new forms of revolt. You know them, you experience them, you see them in your iPhones. Popular uprisings, indignant youth, toppled down dictators, oligarchic presidents dismissed, hopes dashed and liberty crushed in prisons, fixed trials and bloodbaths. How are we to read these images? Could revolt, called riot on the web, be, in this digital age, in the process of shaking up humankind from its dreams of hyperconnections? Or could it just be a trick played on us by the culture of the spectacle in order for it to last longer? But what do we mean by revolt? Is it even possible in our times where misery is elsewhere, debt, austerity, and unemployment are endemic, when local wars can turn into global ones, and when we run the risk of being flooded by the melting of the ice caps? I wrote The Future of Revolt, the sense and nonsense of revolt, and intimate revolt, they have been mentioned, about 15 years ago. The word revolt has a rich and complex meaning. The ancient forms, the Sanskrit ancient forms of vel and velu, referring to it, goes to the sense of return, uncovering, unraveling, circular movement of the planets, volte-face even, vaudeville too, in French, the volume in the book because you turn pages, and even the Swedish car brand of the rolling Volvo because it turns. Today, this revolt, first and foremost, designates an opposition to already established forms, values, and powers. Ever since the French Revolution, political revolt has represented the secular version of the negativity, a characteristic feature of the life of consciousness, when it attempts to remain faithful to its internal logic. Revolt is a synonym of dignity, Revolt is our mysticism. Albert Camus in L'Homme Révolté underlined this very strongly. But we are increasingly aware that what is called the New World Order, whose democratic advantages no longer need to be affirmed despite its risks and even its dead's end, the New World Order is not propitious to this revolt. Against whom does one revolt if power and values are vacant or corrupt? Or, on an even more and somber note, who can revolt if man is increasingly reduced to a simple conglomerate of organs, no longer a subject, but a simple patrimonial person, endowed with a patrimony in the best situation, not only financial, but also genetic or physiological, free at best to channel hope? If I exaggerate and simplify the present state of affairs, it is only to better highlight what we all perceive. Not only that political revolt had become entangled with the trade-offs between parties whose ideological differences are less or less obvious to us, but it is an essential component of European culture. And this component, a cultural questioning, the culture of doubt and critique, is losing its moral and aesthetic significance. This moral and aesthetic dimension finds itself marginalized and exists only as an ornamental alibi tolerated by the society of the spectacle, of the show, when it is not simply engulfed and made impossible by entertainment culture, performance culture, show business culture. Revolt, then, as return, turning back, displacement, change, interrogation of itself and of values, interrogation of any system, of any dogmas. This revolt constitutes the internal logic of a certain cultures whose acuity seems quite threatened these days. And that I would like to revive here is the necessity to bring again our minds and our interest to this sense, to this understanding of the life of our consciousness as revolting consciousness, and only in this sense creative ones. But let us return to the meaning of this revolt again, that seems to be to indicate what is most alive and promising about our culture. Since Socrates and Plato, and more explicitly with Christian theology, man has been invited to a return, volvo, go back to his mind, go back to tradition, go back to values. Some of you may know of what I'm thinking today and consider that retrospective questioning is in favor of outright rejection of the old, which is meant to be suppressed by new dogmas. Because today, I cannot stress enough the fact that totalitarianism is the result of a certain fixation of the revolt in what is precisely its betrayal, namely the suspension of retrospective return, which amounts to a suspension of thought, as Hannah Arendt has brilliantly developed this elsewhere. I'm therefore seeking experiences in the sense that the German makes it in two words, Erlebnis and Erfahrung, surprise and comprehension, astonishment, discrepancy, destruction of the unity, and knowledge and patient elaboration of this experiment. So I am seeking experiences in the double sense of Erlebnis and Erfahrung, in which this work of revolt, which opens psychic life to infinite recreation and interrogation, continues and reoccurs, even at the price of errors and dead end. Indeed, we should not delude ourselves. It is not enough to revive the permanence of revolt, which technology may have inhibited, which is not only necessary to resist dogmas and try to revive revolts and interrogation in order to secure happiness or some sort of serene stability of being. Revolt is very risky. Revolt exposes the speaking being to an unbearable conflictuality. And our 20th century has assumed the daunting privilege of manifesting the necessary enjoyment, la jouissance of the revolt, but also the morbid dead ends associated with conflictuality, and that are the shadow, the black aspect of the revolting consciousness. Because revolt is negativity, and it has been elaborated in the continental philosophy through the notion of negativity that we find in the texts of Hegel, Heidegger, and Sartre. Nothingness and negativity have been patiently and differently discussed in writing like those of Heidegger and Horthy's Metaphysics from 1989, and Sartre in Being and Nothingness from 1943. It may be surprising to maintain that the psychoanalytic movement inaugurated by Freud belongs to this interrogation into nothingness and negativity. I'm talking about the radical interrogation into the psyche that Freud leads to the borders of biology and being, of which we find testimony in a still enigmatic text of 1925, Die Verneinung, negation. For the first time, a few years before What is Metaphysics, from 1929, of Heidegger, Freud links the fate of two types of negations: rejection, proper to the drive, Ausstoßung or Verwerfung, and negativity, which is internal to judgment. In substance, he maintains that the symbol and or thought are a sort of negativity, which itself is nothing but a transformation under certain conditions of rejection proper to the drive, which he calls the dead drive elsewhere. So the revolt is on the wave of this negativity, but it's also capable to bind it into catexis. And here is the Freudian conception of revolt that will be my field and into which I'll try to invite you to follow me in the following. These different currents of theoretical thought in philosophy and psychoanalysis have had this singularity in modernity. They have attained, through retrospective questioning, that is, through inquiry or analysis, some border region of the human experience, which is the region of psychosis, which is on the border of the human itself. But we have been able, in this culture of revolt, not only to experience this discrepancy of human being into psychosis, but to give a language, a transmission, a communication of this experience, and to widen the scope of social link by inserting this revolt into the civilization. Because parallel to philosophy and psychoanalysis, in ways non-theoretical but proper to language itself this time, the practice of writing attains nonsense, the negativity until void, until death, until destruction, which we'll call nonsense too, by unfolding meaning to sensation and drive, instinctual drives, finding its pulse in order that is no longer symbolic, but that I call semiotic. That's what painting, music, drama, theater, gesture, dance give to this essential revolt, negativity, destruction plus catexis. I'm thinking of the desemantization of style in some modern writings through ellipsis in late Mallarmé, for instance, late symbolism, or through polyphonic or portmanteau words in Joyce. Through language and a linguistic overcompetence, an apparent regression is obtained in modern art, a regression that apparently looks like an infantile state of language. What I call the semiotic chora, this space of revolt, this infralinguistic musicality that all poetic language aims for, becomes the main objective of modern poetry, a sort of experimental psychosis. What I mean by this is that psychosis here is the work of a subject that is able to revolt against some systems, some dogmas, some social norms, and this is a subject that puts himself also on trial, not only the norms, but his own identity. And it is through the archaeology of his unity as a human being, led within the material of language and through itself, that the speaking subject reaches an unsafe regions where this unity is annihilated and rebuilt. I have mentioned of psychoanalysis and art as languages that convey the risks of revolt until psychosis and also the insertion of this experience into the cultural code. But the revolt that seeks rebirth, which constitutes the psychic life of the analysis that I have on my couch, is not far from what every person feels when listening to his or her inner self, traversed by complex logic, two of whose movements are familiar to you all. I mean the need to believe and the desire to know. Let me now cross a particular domain in my research these last years that I call the need to believe and the desire to know. Two psychoanalytical experiences confront the clinician with the need to believe. The first refers to what Freud, in response to Romain Rolland's solicitation, describes, not without reluctance, as an oceanic feeling. It's in his book, Civilization in its Discontent. It has to do with the intimate union of the ego and the surrounding world, experienced as an absolute certainty of satisfaction and security, as well as of a loss of self, in favor of that which surrounds and contains us, in favor of a container. This alludes to the experience of the infant that has not yet established borders between his or her ego and the maternal body, indisputable and indivisible, given only to some for whom regression can go far enough, and yet authenticated by Freud as an original experience of the ego. This regression, this oceanic feeling, is pre-linguistic and translinguistic experience. It's dominated by sensation, is at the heart of belief. Belief, not in the sense of a supposition that is examined by logicians, but the belief that rather refers to an unshakable certainty, a sensorial plenitude, and ultimate truth that the subject feels as an excessive, indistinctly sensorial and mental, and strictly speaking, ecstatic, over or super life. I have examined this ecstatic situation in writings of some writers, lay, secular, but also in the text of a great saint of the Catholic Church, Saint Teresa of Avila, which was, by the way, from Maran tradition. But certain aesthetic works bear evidence of this ecstatic state of mind when the self is in a situation of revolt against social norms, against every kind of identity, and even against its own convictions and borders. Certain aesthetic works bear evidence of this, and I have recognized it quite particularly in the work of Marcel Proust. The narrator mentions dreams, dreams without imaginary. He calls them the dreams of the second apartment, because on the first apartment there are personages, there are narratives, there are images. The dreams of the second department are interwoven with pleasure and pain, and we believe, he specifies, unnameable, which draw upon the extreme intensity of the five senses that only a cascade of metaphors can attempt to translate. The story of these dreams may be interpreted as a triumph over what I will call an endogenous autism of the speaking being, of every one of us. This endogenous autism is another aspect of the psychosis to which revolt can reach. And I shall speak about the political aspect of this kind of revolting of the self. But let's stay for now on the aesthetic and psychological revolt. So it reaches the endogenous autism that lives in the unconscious depth of us all, as the psychoanalyst Francis Tustin would see it. Is the writer then the one who succeeds where the autist fails? This is my hypothesis about the genius of Proust. The second experience of this belief, the need to believe and the desire to know, one of the aspects is this oceanic feeling where we lose the language and we're overwhelmed by sensations and pre-linguistic semiotic presence, which is not significance, but just sense, sensorial and affective one. The second experience of belief deals with what Freud will call the primary identification with the father of the personal prehistory. I would like to draw your attention to this paternal figure, not only because it's less familiar even to the psychoanalyst, because it's not the Oedipal father, the father of the law of interdiction, but the loving father of the children's prehistory, but also because it raises questions about the re-examination of the paternal function in the modern reconstructed families and the role of the father in these families. But it will be the most social aspect of my lecture. Let's see now how I can understand this need to believe as connected to the figure of the pre-linguistic, primordial, prehistorical, says Freud, father of the prehistorical history, prehistorical trajectory of the speaking being. Let us take Psalm 116:10, the verse 10. The Hebrew text says, He Mounti ki adaber. My trust does not fail when I say I am completely wretched. In my terror I said, no human being can be relied on. St. Paul, in the second letter to the Corinthians, said, echoing Psalm 116, I believed and therefore I have spoken, in English. Because a few lines before this statement, and so on, the psalmist evokes God's merciful ear. I loved God, Lord, because he had heard my voice and my supplications. The loving other, so, and by recollecting the many interpretations of the Hebrew word ki adaber, which can be understood as and or because or despite, I understand the verse as follows. Because you speak to me and listen to me, you, the third part, not me and the baby, but the third part, that I don't know, that is beyond my biology, beyond my social existence, beyond my presence. Because you speak to me and listen to me, I believe and I speak despite the unnameable. You see, the context of the psalm is quite explicit. It associates faith, emuna, in which we hear the root amen, faith and belief, with speechless acts or speaking acts which specific and different and even deceptive meaning is obvious. I say that I'm wretched, I say that I failed, that I'm depressed, and so on. Although I say this, I believe because you speak to me, I can speak to you. Faith because you faith in me and I faith in you, I can speak. Faith holds the key of the speech act itself, be it that of complaint, I am unhappy, people lie to me, etc. Because I believe, I speak. I wouldn't speak if I didn't believe. To believe what I say and to persist in saying it grows out of the capacity to believe in the other and not from the inevitably disappointing existential experience. But what is this belief? The Latin word credo, I'll use now my linguistic capacities and what my teacher, beloved teacher, Emile Benveniste, taught me about the roots of the Sanskrit language. The credo comes from the Sanskrit cred, sraddha, which denotes an act of confidence in a god, involving restitution in the form of a divine favor accorded to the faithful. It is from this root that the financial term credit is derived. Credo, faith, and credit come from the main root. I set down a good and I await my pay. We can notice that faith and credit are in crisis in the modern world. The psychoanalytical experience of the child and the adult attest to the crucial moment of development where the infant projects himself onto an outsider, a third agency, with whom he identifies, and this is the agency of the loving father. On the one hand, there is the oceanic feeling of losing oneself in the maternal envelope, but also infinitely likening oneself to the carrier wave of her protection. Isn't this what the believer feels in the grace of his or her communion with the divine, and that Romain Rolland asked Freud to interpret? And on the other hand, and closer to our questioning of the paternal function in the religious link, let us recall what Freud calls a primary identification. This identification with the primordial father. This primary identification with the father of individual prehistory is the dawn of the symbolic outsider, who replaces the fascination and the horror of the dual interdependence of the mother and the child. This confident recognition offered by the father who loves the mother, it is loved by her, and that I in turn become. This identification, this faith, changes my stemming into linguistic sciences, whose value he determines. Science and objects, but mostly science of my jubilation and my fears, of my early years of life, spoken words transform my angst into a believing expectation. Believing expectation and psychization, building of language capacity, come together. This is what Freud calls glaubige Erwartung, believing expectation and emergence of language capacity. Loving paternal listening gives meaning to what would otherwise be an inexpressible trauma, a nameless excess of pleasure and pain. But it is not I who construct this primary identification, nor is it the loving father who imposes it on me. The primary identification is, he said, direct and immediate, directe und unmittelbare, like lightning or hallucination. It is through the father loving mother's sensitivity and discourse, through the mother's agency, that I'm capable to this faith. And here we have a hint of Freud about the complexity of the maternal passion, which is not only a biological one, but she gives the capacity of the child to link himself to the other, which is already a transcendence of him, and vertical and also social, the paternal function and the otherness as such. So before Laius, the Oedipal father, we have this imaginary father who, by recognizing me and loving me through the mother, lets me know that I'm not her, but other, a stranger, and stranger loved by him, elected by him. Judaism had given a lot of hints and myths about this construction of the personality, of the creative subjectivity capable of revolt because elected by the primordial other. We are here on the basis of the universal legacy of some aspects of Judaism in my mind. So it makes me believe that I can believe by selecting me as a particular stranger in his own Akeda, I'll say. Freud uses the word katexis, Besetzung, linking, alliance, to beliefs and or to katect, not in him as an object of need or desire, but in his representation of me, in his words, in the representation that make of him and of me an agent of words. I believed, and therefore I am. On this foundation alone, my need to believe, thus satisfied and offering me optimal conditions of language acquisition, can be accompanied by another capacity that is both corrosive and liberating. This is the desire to know. But the desire to know in our psychoanalytic experience is not capable to be built without the satisfaction of the pre-religious, anthropological, and universal need to believe in the aspects that I try to define today. Carried by this faith that lets me hear a loving, loved outsider, I burst into questions. Who hasn't witnessed the pleasurable trance of a child asking questions, still straddling the border between the flesh of the world and the kingdom of language? The child knows with a hallucinatory knowledge that all identity is a constructible, deconstructible chimera. Lacan thought that the motto for psychoanalysis should be silicet in Latin, which means you can know. He forgot to mention that you can know if and only if you believe you know. From knowing to believing, and vice versa, such is the eternal turnstile of speaking being. Now, how this concerns people working with adolescents, which is the experience of all of us here in schools and universities. I'll reach the psychology of the adolescent on the background of the revolt and of this double aspect of human mind, believing and knowing. Freud said a lot about the child, but not much about adolescent. He opposed the child, who is for him a polymorphic pervert, because he wants to know where babies come from. And for that, Freud compared him to laboratory researchers. He opposed him to the adolescent. Why? I think because the adolescent is not a laboratory researcher. He is a believer. Freud didn't work about believers because he was maybe the greatest, the most strong atheist, not believer that ever exists. But now we can speak about believers without being afraid to be devoured by them. We are all adolescents when we are enthralled by the absolute. Freud did not preoccupy himself with them. He was a firm non-believer, I already said. Faith implies a passion for what psychoanalysts call an object relation. Faith is potentially fundamentalist, as is the adolescent. Romeo and Juliet are excellent examples of this. Dante Dante Alighieri and Beatrice, Adam and Eve, they believed in paradise. They are all amorous, and we are all adolescents when we are in love. I will assert that the adolescent is a believer of the object relations and or of its impossibility. Thus formulated, the question implies a parameter that we have trouble taking seriously. This parameter is ideality. And I will sustain that the adolescent is structured as a believer because he is in a search for ideality, but he is also in a malady of ideality. Why? The adolescent Oedipus complex is violent because it operates on the carrier wave of idealization. The adolescent, whose psyche is rooted in the polymorphous perversity of the young child, separates from the parental couple by replacing it with a new model, a new partner that will be better than my parents, new job, better philosophy, better and best literature, ideology, and so on. He wants, and he deserves, and he thinks that it's possible, he searches an absolute satisfaction. And he or she can erase the original and tragic Oedipus complex and to rush toward a new love that will open the doors of a new paradises. Images, ideologies, different from a knowledge and existent models, or all brought into play to share up an idealized narcissism. The belief that there exists an ideal object, be it a partner, a profession, or a creation, is nevertheless accompanied by an absolute belief that the parental couple must be surpassed and even abolished, and that adolescent object and adolescent subject can escape into an idealized paradisical variant of absolute satisfaction. The Judeo-Christian paradise is an adolescent creation. The adolescent takes pleasure in the paradise syndrome, which conversely can also become a source of suffering if absolute ideality turns into cruel persecution. Because he believes that the absolute exists, every deception will be experienced as a failure, and the believer becomes a nihilist. We understand that structured by idealization, adolescence is constructed as a malady of ideality. Either the adolescent lacks ideality, it's not enough good for him, or in a given context, his ideality fails to adapt to his post-puberty drive, and thus to his need to share with an absolute satisfying object. Adolescent ideality is necessarily demanding and in a state of crisis, for the drive-ideality interaction is constantly in peril and disintegration. Adolescent belief inexorably mixes with adolescent nihilism. Why? Because that exists an absolute, I have no choice but to be angry when the absolute doesn't exist. Or else, because that exists, yet he or she disappoints me, or I miss them, I have no choice but to take it out of myself. This is the scene of mutilations and self-destructive behavior that follows. Or in other contexts, the drug addiction that abolishes the conscious but fulfills the belief in an absolute of orgasmic regression within the experience of hallucinatory pleasure. That is what is given by the drug addiction. In another aspect, anorectic behavior breaks with the maternal line and gives a riot against the maternal body and reveals the young woman's battle against femininity. Yet, this is in favor of an overinvestment of the hardline body, which echoes back to the fantasy of an absolute spirituality. All those destructive behaviors are on the basis of a search of ideality, which is as absolute as it can be destructive. Civilization, commonly referred to as primitive, have long used initiation rites to assert symbolic authority. Divine for the invisible world, political for the world here, and to justify the acting out of what we could qualify as perverse by condoning initiatory sexual practices. In some ancient societies, when you have initiation rites, they have sceneries of initiatory sexual practices that are quite perverse in order to give place to these destructions of norms, to this rebellious attitude, and to control them and to accompany them. We are, the Western culture, notably in medieval Christianity, allowed mortification rituals and excessive fasting that channeled the anorectic and sadomasochistic behavior of adolescents in the medieval ages, and in so doing either downplayed or glorified them. But today, our civilization, which lacks such kind of right, is the only civilization that lacks rituals for adolescents and doesn't answer to this need to believe of the adolescents. The religious need, replaced throughout the 20th century by ideological enthusiasm, has served and continues to serve as a means of authentifying the ideality syndrome. A lot of us were Trotskyists, Maoists, etc. It's no coincidence that alongside the adolescent malaise, which so worries modern society, we see now religion making a comeback, often in bastardized form, sects, for instance, or with a fundamentalist twist encouraging the death drive. In this context, adolescence revolt can perhaps be seen in terms of a challenge to interpret and to help us to interpret the variants of our civilization's new malaise and this renaissance of the need to believe that takes the place of the revival of the religious sects. A need which we ourselves share, for there is in us a perpetual adolescent. To conclude, I would like to emphasize the revolt we call the suburban troubles, but also they exist in other countries where the differences between different social groups are particularly obvious for some and experienced as a frustration for others. Isn't it a failure of the Western model of secularization when we see the forms of revolt adopting integrist aspects and going into a criminal association with fundamentalists? I'm thinking of the riots in France, the tragic case of an adolescent Mera in Toulouse who killed Jewish students in schoolboys and schoolgirls in a school. I'm thinking also of those of French students that convert to Islam and go to transform themselves in criminal human bombs in Syria. Is this a failure of the Western model of secularization that cannot accompany the need to idealization and revolt of our adolescents in some limit situations? In fact, the matter is more grave yet. We are beneath the clash of religion. And I'll try to explain why I think that the crisis you see in this situation is not capable to be shared and resolved by religions, but asked to us, educators, humanists, people belonging to different fields of social sciences, to deepen our researches, our knowledge of adolescents and their social surroundings too, in order to accompany them in these limits of the human life and the religious experience itself. I think that the delinquency of these disadvantaged teens, in fact, reveals a more radical phase of nihilism, a phase taking place beneath the clash of religions. This delinquency is more dire because it concerns the deeper mechanism of civilization, highlighting the destruction of this pre-religious need to believe I spoke previously, and that constitutes the psychic life with and for others I am attempting to shed light upon today. Adolescent gangster fundamentalism, we have this in London suburbs, we have it also in some American schools, has suddenly revealed that the religious treatment of revolt has itself lost credibility, being insufficient to ensure the paradisical aspiration of the paradoxical believer that is the adolescent, a nihilistic believer, necessarily nihilist because pathetically idealistic, that is the discontented, desocialized teenager in the ruthlessness of the global immigration. Psychoanalysis speaks in connection of such kind of mental experiences, speaks to this deep disorganization of the self by diagnosing it as an unbinding of the self. In this situation, I doesn't exist, nothing but an unbinding drive ready to go to any extreme. And destruction also not only of the self, unbinding of the self, but the disorganization of the relationship to the other, to the point of what we call a disobjectalization. The other has neither meaning nor value. We are not in the multiculturalism here. The otherness doesn't exist. The death drive alone, the malignancy of evil triumphs. And so we found ourselves facing what the classical philosophy had called radical evil in a new way. What is radical evil? It consists, following Kant and Hannah Arendt, in asserting and realizing the superfluidity and the superfluity of human beings. They are being sentenced to death. There are some people that I don't consider as such. The other doesn't exist. I'm overwhelmed by a death drive. My I doesn't exist. Unbinding of the self and disobjectalization, no relation to the other. Is radical evil without reason? My friend André Green thought that and said that mysticism and literature and also psychoanalysis cannot find the reason of this kind of dismantling of humanity. They say their own way by pointing the situation, but without trying to find the reasons. We, on the contrary, I mean we, the political act, we, the educators, we, the teachers, we cannot stop here. With the psychoanalytical experience, I don't content myself to revolt or to say that I don't know why people react like this, and even less so when against radical evil comes. I seek the logic of extreme evil so as to refine the interpretation in the transference and counter-transference. We discover that following familiar disintegration and social failures, and here interdisciplinary work is necessary with family specialists and specialists of social bonds. Certain people, especially adolescents, succumb to the disease of ideality. They literally explode, incapable of distinguishing good from evil, inside from outside, or subject from object. Of the two drives that exist within us, the drive of life and the drive of death, it is the death drive that resolves their psychic life, that sinks into blind destructivity and finally self-destruction. The need to believe collapses in the empire of unbinding and disobjectalization, accompanied by a mad pleasure or an emptiness and apathy. I saw just before coming on the French television an interview of the French journalist with a Catholic adolescent that converted to integral Islam, and she's ready to go to Syria, and she speaks about this in a sort of apathy and smile that doesn't see who is in front of her. It's a particular stand and state of mind that nobody experienced and observed previously, and it becomes criminal in the following stages eventually of her life. But our capacity to find the difficulties and the dangers of such kind of psychological development, our incapacity is the responsible of this end eventually pathetic of this young girl. Here we make the distinction, and I would like to be clear. Yes, there exists on the one side an evil that comes from the clash of values, from the clash of religions, themselves produced by divergent or competing libidinal and ideological interests, and which underlie our conception of good and evil. Religious man and the moral man are constitutive of these values in competition. More or less guilty and enraged, they leave them, worry them, and hope to elucidate them so as to listen to, or rather than to kill one another. This is the history of religion. There are always been this kind of conflicts and wars. But besides this evil, there exists another extreme evil where the urge of the death drive occupies the whole scene. It sweeps away the sense of distinction between good and evil, and thereby destroys the possibility of accessing the other's existence, meaning, and even the meaning of oneself. These extreme states of evil don't take refuge in hospitals or on the psychoanalytic couch only, but unfold in socio-political catastrophes and in the objection of extermination such as the Holocaust, that horror which defies explanation and reason. But the new forms of extreme evil are spreading also in a globalized world in the wake of disease of ideality and our incapacity to accompany this disease of ideality, which is excessive in its search of purity and excessive in his destructive negativity. And it is from this diagnosis that the audacity of psychoanalytic care springs in my mind, seeking to be more than a comprehensive moralism. We are not philosophers, we are social workers in a sense, because the psychoanalytic care places the analyst at the unsustainable intersection where he or she risks her own self, her own mind, being closer as closer possible to the disobjectalization, objectalization that is obvious in the mind of those adolescents. Such is our challenge after the discovery of the death drive from Freud and the malignant possession of the psychic apparatus that dwells within its ability to produce diseases of ideality. These diseases of the soul destroy the need to believe and the desire to know, such that human being rendered incapable of cathexis, incapable to invest himself in established relationships, dispossess themselves and lack a sense of the other, wanders aimlessly in the absence of the world, in a non-world with neither good nor evil nor value of any kind. Is it possible to push analytical listening to the borders of Homo sapiens and to continue practicing psychoanalysis in this condition? The political space today is facing a historic challenge. Is it capable of confronting this crisis of the need to believe and the desire to know, which is no longer contained by the lead of religion and which touches the very depth of the bound between human beings? The anguish paralyzing the general politics in these times of excess and against the backdrop of economic and social crisis expresses out our incertitude before a colossal issue. Because I think that the modern crisis is not only political, it's not only financial, economic, it's an anthropological one. It's a civilizational and anthropological one. Are we capable of mobilizing all of our resources, politics, economics, not to mention those which give as knowledge souls, to care for the harrowing disease of ideality that is engulfing us and which is expressed by adolescents from good neighborhoods and even more so in lawless areas. I spoke about adolescents that are seduced by integrism, but I spoke also about those from the other areas of urban culture with anorexia, with suicide, with drug addiction, different mortifications and so on, where the death instinct is prevailing and overwhelmed also by the toxicity of internet, and can push a great number of adolescents in such kind of destruction and disobjectivation. Can we care for them with the necessary delicacy and attentiveness, with an appropriate education, and with the generosity needed? Interpreted as such, the crisis of youth who call out for God, and we are best by the malignancy of evil, necessarily concerns us. I have attempted to tell you how it concerns me. I think that we are capable to understand this and to accompany those people in their suffering. Am I optimistic? Maybe too optimistic. I would define myself rather as an energetic pessimist who appreciates only an active intelligence in thought or active presence of intelligence close to the suffering of our youngsters. And so I ask, what is one to do? What are we to do? To quote Nietzsche, he says in a more intellectual and abstract way, we have to put a big question mark in the place of heavy seriousness. To put a big question mark in the place of heavy seriousness, and this heavy seriousness is God or ideality, the malady of ideality, the God's place, which is the place of extreme purity and extreme danger. And he says we have to put this question mark in the sense to transvaluate it, not to abolish it, not to ignore it, but to transvaluate it. And I mean that with philosophy, with anthropology, psychoanalysis, because it is a theory, but a practice also, can help education and morality, and will be a decisive point in this transvaluation. Umwertung aller Werte. Transvaluate values, passions, needs to believe and desire to know. This will be maybe the actual stage in which the revolt that Camus required for us can give us the possibility to be philosophers, to be teachers, and to be educators also, and also therapists. Not give up before evil, not even before extreme evil, but patiently pursue the search, certainly not of who knows what utopian balance, but rather the search for a path towards that fragile point described by Blaise Pascal as a perpetual motion, he says, when he wrote the following, and I am quoting to finish. Whosoever would find the secret of rejoicing in the good without troubling himself with its contrary evil would have hit the point. It is perpetual motion. And what if the revolt we lack today is precisely this point, this perpetual motion towards the secret of rejoicing in the good, faith, desire to know, need to believe, without troubling oneself with the contrary evil, this radical evil. It necessitates from the social workers, from the educators, from the artists, to be very, very aware of certain interior experience that we have to deepen in ourselves, to be awakened in each of you, this interior experience, and in those who listen to us, in order to continue the revolt as the source of creativity and life of this culture. Thank you very much.